Mataru, Hamindadura, Hijache, Wyandot, Kwache. I said, hello, my friends. Hamindadura is who I am. Wyandot is who we are. And Hamindadura is my Wyandot tribal name. It means he who talks long, long time. It actually means his words have meaning. And I just want to say once again, thank you to everyone that's here tonight. Thank you. I always offer, we're so gracious for all that's been done in Upper Sandusky to preserve our history and to keep that history alive and to keep the old mission church. I mean, it's a miracle that the old mission church is still there. And, and it's for a reason. I always say when you do the right thing, for the right reason, good things happen. And, there's a reason that church is still there today. And I want to talk, I had the distinct privilege of being in Tiffin, Ohio on Tuesday and spending the day at Heidelberg University and giving a lecture that night on genocide. And this year the focus was on Native American genocide. And so I just want to share a little bit of story. You're going to see pictures that are scrolling through here, and this is the Wyandot Nation today. And this was from this past year, from our powwow to our cultural gathering to our little turtles camp, we'll call it. And this is what's going on today, but this isn't always how it's been. And I just want to start by just laying out a scenario and a hypothetical to you. And I want to take you to a place where the Wyandots were in 1843. And I want you to imagine tomorrow morning when you wake up and there's a national broadcast, emergency broadcast system, and it's going to be followed by a message in case something is happening. And that message goes out on the TV tomorrow morning and it says, to all citizens of the state of Ohio, this is the president. And he says, we have some very bad news. Because of the wars that we've been fighting and because of the great debt that's been incurred by the United States, and because we've had to use land for collateral, we're going to have to give up the land of Ohio. The Republic of China in 188 days is going to take over this land, and you've got 180 days to begin to prepare to leave. In 180 days, we're going to line train cars up, and you're going to have to pack all the belongings that you have into one small space. And in 180 days, you're going to have to leave, and you're going to have to go to Nuevo Laredo, Old Mexico. We've got land set aside for you and your family there. You say, well, we can't do that. Our kids are in college. You don't understand. We own this land. It's been in our family for 5 generations. We can't leave. Our grandfather, he's on dialysis. He can't. He's not well enough to travel. Doesn't matter. You have 180 days, or we will forcibly remove you. That was the Wyandots in 1843. We owned farms. Our children were going to school. We worshiped together with those that were here. But we had to leave. We had children. We had elderly. They put us on horse and wagon. They take us to Cincinnati and they put us on steamboats. We've been promised 148,000 acres west of the Mississippi in what is now Kansas City, Kansas. The steamboats drop us off in the middle of the night on the banks of the Missouri River in the Bottoms, it's called. If you go there today, it's down around Caw Point. At that point, it was Westport. We was on the other side, but they drop us off in the middle of the night. The steamboat captains didn't want us on the ship in the first place. He got us all up on the ship, and they sailed away, and we have 664 tribal citizens on the banks of the river. And guess what? The 148,000 acres aren't there. The land that was promised, there's no land. We lose 100 citizens who die of mainly disease the first year. We're finally able to negotiate with the Delawares to purchase land. We purchased 36 tracts of land, and as a gift, they give us 3 tracts. And the Wyandots begin to build the city of Kansas City. They begin to plat it out. You see, when we were in Ohio, we had done everything that we were asked to do. We had assimilated. We had become Christians. Our children were going to school. We had a postmaster, one of our citizens. We had ordained Methodist ministers. And so we get to Kansas City, and the story of the Wyandots is a story of adaptation and perseverance. We were always being able to adapt and persevere despite the circumstances. So we began once again to rebuild in what is Kansas City, Kansas. We began to plat out the city. You go to Kansas City today and you drive through and you see the names of the streets. You'll see Sandusky Street. You'll see Walker Street. You'll see Armstrong Street. You'll see all the names of the Wyandots throughout that city. You see different places that you know was Wyandot. You go to Quindaro, who one of my ancestors, Nancy Quindaro Brown. Quindaro was a Wyandot name, meant bundle of sticks, or their strength and unity. Her and her husband, Abelard Guthrie, they established the town of Quindaro, where it became the site of the largest underground railroad, where the Wyandots would bring the slaves across from Missouri. They would bring them across on riverboats. They would cover them with corn stalks and bring them to Quindaro, and they would free them. We built 2 Methodist churches. Once again, we began to thrive. So much so that in 1855, the government said, "We want that land." And they forced us to become U.S. citizens. In 1867, those who wanted to retain their Indian identity had to leave. They said, if you want to be Indian, then you have to go to Indian Territory. Matthew Mudeater is a chief at that time. He led 220 Wyandots to what is now Wyandot, Oklahoma. No land once again. All those tribes that were in Ohio, the Senecas, the Shawnees, the Miamis, the Ottawas, they were already there in Oklahoma because we were the last ones to leave Ohio. When Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, the majority of those tribes were forced to leave at that point. We were the last tribe to leave, and when we come into this town, I love the signs. Home of the last Wyandot reservation. And so we arrive in Oklahoma with 220 citizens, and once again begin to rebuild. We purchased 25,000 acres from the Seneca tribe, the Seneca Cayuga, and it's where we're at today. And once again, you have a people who's retained their identity. They're still doing the ceremonies, the green corn. They're still practicing their culture and their tradition. And the thought I spoke at Heidelberg University was talking about cultural genocide, because that's what was taking place with the Wyandots, was cultural genocide. Because guess what? The U.S. government had no idea what to do with Indian people. I always give a disclaimer before I speak before anyone. I say there's 566 federally recognized Indian nations in the United States. We have 566 sovereign nations inside of our country. I only speak for the Wyandots. I cannot speak for any other tribe, because all of us are different. And the U.S. government never got that. They thought that an Indian was an Indian. Well, that's like saying you can take a German, and you could take somebody from Spain, and you could take somebody from Mexico, and just think that they're all the same. Well, they all speak different languages. They all have different cultures. They come from different places. That's the way the tribes were. And so the government says, we're going to build Indian boarding schools. And guess what the motto of those Indian boarding schools that hung over the doors of them? Kill the Indian, save the man. They would bring the kids in. And anytime, in fact, one of my board of directors, Juanita McQuiston, she's 87 years old. She tells the story when she went to Indian boarding school. There was a boarding school right in Wyandot. And anytime that she spoke Wyandot, they would take her out and beat her. They made the boys wear military uniforms. They wouldn't let them grow their hair like they did before. And so they would literally go into the homes and take the kids out away from the parents. So there in Wyandot, guess what would happen? They would get the Wyandot and the Seneca kids and the Shawnee kids, and they would bring them to Wyandot to the Seneca Indian School. And guess what? The first chance those kids got, what'd they do? They ran away. They went back home. And they would go get them again, and so this isn't working. So guess what? We're going to take Wyandot kids and we're going to send them to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Carlisle Indian Institute. We're going to send them to Riverside Indian School in California. So guess what parents started doing? Don't tell anybody you're an Indian. Don't tell anybody. If anybody asks, you're not Wyandot. If they find out, they're going to take you away from us. And so I grew up 6 miles from Wyandot, Oklahoma. Born in 1963. I'll be 53 here in a couple months. And so when I was growing up 6 miles from Wyandot, Oklahoma, you know, the only way that I knew I was Wyandot was because the government issued me a card. We're the only ones that have to carry a card telling how much Indian we are. It's a CDIB card, Certificate Degree of Indian Blood. I always say, well, I tell people I'm Indian. Well, how much Indian are you? Well, how much white are you? I don't know what to say. Does it matter? If you have 1 drop of Indian blood, you're Indian. But I grew up, and it's not only me, the whole generation that I grew up in. We have John Tracy Wright, who's close to the same age. He's younger than me.
Fair bit.
Yeah. Grew up in Wyandot, and he can attest to it. I never knew the Wyandots were in Ohio. I never knew the Wyandots were in Michigan. I didn't know that I traced back to a gentleman by the name of Adam Brown, who founded Brownstown, Michigan, who was a boy at 12 years old, growing up in Greenbrier, Virginia, was captured by a Wyandot war party, captured and brought back to Michigan and raised as an Indian, married a Wyandot woman, had no idea of what it meant to be Wyandot. There was a whole generation. You see the cultural genocide that was taking place because 2 or 3 generations were told, don't tell anybody you're Indian. You know, don't let anybody know. I came to the work for the tribe in 1998 as a health and wellness director, thinking that this is, you know, I was going to work here for a few years and then go somewhere else. Went to work there. We had a chief by the name of Leopard Bearskin. Some of you in this room know Chief Bearskin. Chief Bearskin was chief for 28 years. Chief Bearskin came back to Wyandot in 1983. He had a very distinguished career. He was a B-24 bomber pilot, World War II, flew 46 missions. Him and his twin brother grew up in the little town of Wyandot, graduated there in 1939, came back and began to build a foundation. When I came to work there, I began to learn about all the history and how that when we were in this area, you know, we were one of the revered tribes. The tribes in this area looked up. We were the keepers of the council fire. Even the Delawares, the Lenape, who were considered the grandfathers, they looked at us and called us the uncle. When the tribes would gather in this area for a council, for when things were going on, when the settlers were moving in and the armies were moving this way, they would call for a council, and the Wyandots would head those councils up. They would come to us for advice. I didn't know that. I began to learn, hey, I'm proud to be Wyandot. You know, I began to learn what it is to be Wyandot. And I began to challenge those around me. And when I was elected second chief in 2006, I sat down and I said, we're not going to have any more generations of kids that do not know what it means to be Wyandot Indian. And we started programs like our summer intern program that you all have been so gracious each and every summer to host us. And we hire every high school and college age student in the summer. And so we hire 25 to 30 kids. And number one, they have a job, which their parents are thankful for because they're getting paid. And another two, it exposes them to the tribe. And they begin to see these things. And then at the end of the summer, we bring them on a historical journey, and we bring them to Upper Sandusky. We bring them to Michigan. And when we bring them here, what we do on their name tags, their name may be Smith now, it may be Jones, but on their name tag, we put the family that they trace back to from Ohio. And those kids, when we bring them to that cemetery, and when they begin to look at the names on the back of that church, and they begin to see those cemetery markers, they begin to look, and then they look at their name tag, and that's one of my ancestors. They begin to make a connection. Because, as Jan said, we think 7 generations ahead. And I want my grandchildren, I want my children and my grandchildren, their children and grandchildren, I want them to know what it is to be Wyandot, what that means. I want them to know their history and be able to look and take pride in that. These things that you're seeing on the powwow and different things such as that, this stuff is all that just started taking place in the last 10 years. The last 10 to 15 years. We've had our powwow now for 25 years. We just opened up our cultural center and our museum this past September. Some of you all were there. I came down for that. And so, I always tell everyone, the Wyandots and Chief Bearskin taught me, he said, you can never go forward by looking backwards. We're not a bitter people. We're not a people that look back with regret or anger. We know that things happen for a reason. I spoke the first time in the Old Mission Church when I was invited to come up one summer. And I used the verse Romans 8:28, for all things work together for the good for those who love God. That doesn't say everything that happens is good, because sometimes bad things happen to us. But in the end, it's working for our good. And it's worked for our good today. Today, the Wyandot Nation, we're thriving like never before. Our nations are all coming together once again. The Androdon, the Kansas, and our brothers and sisters in Canada. We're working together. And today we offer programs and cultural programs. Our kids are going to learn, they're learning the language. They're learning to bead. They're learning how to shoot bows and arrows. All the things that Wyandots once did when we were here in Ohio and Michigan. So today, if Chief Bearskin was here, I can always remember what he said, I'm one proud Indian chief. We've got a lot of great people in Wyandot, Oklahoma, and some of those who've been there have met them. And everybody has grasped and a hold of the vision of teaching this for the next 7 generations. And you all have been a major part of that, because the history that's been preserved here in Upper Sandusky. I can't say enough for people like Thelma Marsh and Jean and those and Betsy and all of you that's carried that on for us, and how grateful that we are as a people. And every time I have the opportunity to come to Ohio, I do. In closing, I always tell, there's a story, when I first came to Ohio the very first time, and I don't know, I've never had the opportunity to share this with Jan. I have with Chief Roll. But the first time I came to Ohio was in 2006. I was just elected as second chief of our tribe. And over in Sandusky, in Port Clinton actually, there was 3 lots in a very exclusive housing addition. It's called Cove on the Bay. And it's one of the lots, you can actually throw a rock into Lake Erie there. You can see Cedar Point right across the bay there. And anyway, one of those lots, they began to dig it up, and there was a graveyard there, and it was Woodlands Indians. And it probably even predated Wyandot, but the owner of the land called us, and he told us what happened. And they took the artifacts to the University of Cleveland to study them. But in that, they said there's 2 other lots that they know had even larger burial grounds. And they was afraid that the developer was going to disturb them. And so we were flying out to look at those lots. We eventually purchased those lots to keep them from being disturbed. But I can remember getting in the rental car and leaving the airport in Sandusky and driving across Ohio and all of a sudden having the strangest feeling. And it was a feeling like I had been here before. And like it was almost like I was coming home. And I kept that to myself for a long time because I thought, boy, people are going to think, whoo, he's out there. Until we brought a busload of elders up here about 2 years ago. Tribal elders who had never been here before. Some of them in their 70s and some in their 80s. And probably a half of those who came back and talked to me came in my office and said, you know what, Chief? It was like I had been there before. It's just such an awesome feeling. Thank you so much for having us this weekend. We've been really looking forward to it. I want to thank, like I said, Loretta's coming. She's going to work with the language this week. John, he's brought his daughter. He's going to watch over all of us and keep all of us aligned. That's a full-time job.